Most of us were taught that Britain fell into darkness after the Romans withdrew. But what if 410 AD didn't mark an ending so much as the beginning of several new worlds? In the centuries that followed, the map of Britain splintered into Brittonic kingdoms like Dumnonia, Rheged, Elmet, and Gododdin, names rarely seen in school textbooks. In this documentary, we'll revisit the moment Rome departed and trace how local leaders, warlords, and surviving Roman British elites carved out territories across a fractured landscape. We'll uncover how these Brittonic kingdoms arose before the Anglo-Saxons shaped the names we know today, and how alliances, battles, and cultural exchanges transformed the island long before England or Scotland emerged. If you're ready to explore the forgotten kingdoms that shaped Britain's early history, be sure to subscribe and let us know which lost kingdom intrigues you the most. Around 400 AD, Britain still wore the Roman name, but the seams showed. The province functioned more like a distant workshop than a polished showroom. Governors changed often, messengers arrived late, and decisions made on the Tiber could take months to reach the Thames. That lag bred habit. Local councils, estate owners, and military officers solved problems without waiting for orders. The island acted Roman, but behaved like a frontier. Urban life offered the clearest holdover. Walk the streets of Londinium or Verulamium, and you'd pass basilicas, bathhouses, and grid-planned blocks that signaled imperial habits of order. Councillors handled taxes and repairs, magistrates sat in courts, and public inscriptions still used Latin forms. Yet beyond the towns, everyday life leaned on older Brittonic customs. Field systems followed local tradition, rural shrines blended Roman and native gods, and hilltop sites showed renewed activity. The two worlds existed side by side, tiled roofs and hypocausts in some districts, roundhouses and kin-based authority in others. Language mirrored this mix. Latin remained the language of contracts and official notices, taught by clerks who had learned it as a career skill. Around farmsteads and village markets, Brittonic dialects carried law, gossip, and ancestral memory. Along the east and south coasts, another voice entered the conversation. Germanic speech cropped up where Saxon mercenaries and their families served in garrisons or guarded estates, hired through late Roman federate agreements. Multilingual exchanges happened at quaysides, in barracks, and at fairs, where trade and security demanded quick understanding more than perfect grammar. The Roman army in Britain, once a steady presence, had thinned. Units redeployed to continental crises, pay arrived irregularly, and commanders relied on auxiliary recruits and contract soldiers to plug gaps. With fewer troops to call on, local elites took on tasks that legions once handled. They organized watches on river mouths, patched roads and bridges to keep carts moving, and negotiated truces with raiders or rival districts. Authority flowed down to those who could muster labor and food. Trade told the same story of drift. For centuries, ships brought Mediterranean wine, oil, and fine tableware to British ports. By the early 400s, those imports dropped off. Warehouses showed fewer amphorae, and rural sites held less continental pottery. Markets did not vanish. They rerouted. Coastal communities leaned into Irish Sea and Channel traffic, swapping metals, salt, and livestock for whatever luxuries reached northern waters. Archaeology catches the transition in slow motion. Large villas that once displayed mosaic floors and heated rooms stand half-occupied or reworked for storage and workshops. Some courtyards filled with hearths for small-scale smithing. Elsewhere, estate centers shifted to defensible knolls, hinting at a change in risk and status. Religion shows a similar blend and strain. At Bath, curse tablets scratched in flawed Latin reveal locals still tried Roman ritual technology, even as the social scaffolding that taught proper forms frayed. Money habits lagged behind imperial retreat. Mints in or tied to Britain turned out some of the last coin issues associated with the Western Empire, keeping wages, taxes, and market prices intelligible a little longer than on parts of the continent. Coins moved through town gates and farm markets, a thin thread of familiarity as other systems loosened. So, by 400, Britain carried Roman frames with local weight inside them. Take away the distant voice in the next decade, and those frames no longer align. The result is not silence, but many centers of decision turning outward and inward at once. The message that reached Britain in 410 AD did not send troops, it sent responsibility. Cities were told to guard themselves, and with that, imperial authority ended in practice as well as on paper. No governor arrived to coordinate levels. No courier brought the next tax schedule. Whatever still looked Roman now ran on habit and local will. The moment formal ties snapped, every town council and estate court had to decide how to keep roads open, fields safe, and harbors useful. By then, the imperial machine had already thinned out. Administrative staff left with their paymasters, and officers shifted to continental crises. Without centralized taxation, grain depots emptied without refill, and supply wagons stopped linking forts to markets. Logistics had been the skeleton of Roman power. When it failed, units scattered or settled. Local magnates stepped into the vacuum, commanding labor for ditches, bridges, and palisades, and paying retainers with food, favors, and what coins still circulated. These local centers hardened into regional polities. Town councils handled judgments and tolls. Landholding families raised warbands and cut deals with neighbors. Some communities revived older assemblies. Others kept modified Roman civitas routines. But all operated without a shared chain of command. Borders became fluid lines defined by who could answer a raid by the next sunrise. Authority depended on harvests, kinship, and the ability to move men quickly across short distances. External pressure made these choices urgent. To the north, Pictish groups tested river crossings and lowland approaches. From the west, Irish raiders hit monastic estates and coastal farms, taking portable wealth and hostages. Along the east and south shores, Germanic mercenaries who had guarded estates began to settle families, turning fort gates into villages. Their presence shifted loyalties and introduced new leaders with their own networks. What had been episodic raids began to look like permanent competition. Britain still had walls and forts, but they no longer formed a system. Hadrian's Wall stood as stone and turf without the bureaucracy that fed and rotated garrisons. Watchtowers lit beacons as local warnings, not as links in a provincial plan. Town walls mattered again, and smaller hilltops gained palisades. Defensive labor focused on what a community could see from its gate, not on lines drawn on imperial maps. Economic signals point to a rapid contraction. Mediterranean imports dropped, then nearly vanished. Markets adapted by leaning on coastal and river trade within the island and across the Irish Sea, but the variety of goods shrank. Urban workshops closed or shifted to repair and recycling. Coins became scarce, and prices turned local, negotiated in grain, livestock, or craftwork more often than in cash. Christianity outlasted the bureaucracy that had helped spread it. Bishops and clerics maintained worship, landholdings, and care for the poor, even as correspondence with continental sees grew irregular. Churches offered literacy, record-keeping, and a moral court that could stabilize disputes when secular power fractured. Their networks preserved contracts across regions that otherwise had few reliable lines of communication. The fracture on the eastern shores sent ripples west, but in the far peninsula, a different pattern held. Dumnonia took shape across Cornwall, Devon, and parts of Somerset, building on local authority that predated Rome and outlasted it. Boundaries were rivers, ridges, and coastlines, not neat lines on maps. Power clustered where old hill forts overlooked farmland and sea lanes, and where small courts could gather tribute in kind: cattle, tin, and labor. Language and law kept a Brittonic core. Everyday dealings sounded in native speech, and legal customs favored kin obligation, compensation, and oath-taking recognized by local elites. Art followed the same path: carved stones with knotwork and inscribed crosses, metalwork with curving designs, and memorials that marked status without copying Eastern fashions. This continuity set the region apart as the Southeast moved toward Anglo-Saxon rule and vocabulary. Society arranged itself around hilltop strongholds, open settlements, and seasonal movement between fields and pasture. A royal court might circuit between sites rather than fix in a single capital, dispensing judgments and calling men to arms. The household of a king or sub-king anchored authority: guards, craftsmen, scribes, and clergy, making law visible and portable. Rural communities handled most production and defense, mustering on short notice to guard routes and shorelines. Against pressure from the east, Dumnonia held a line that later hardens in memory as the Tamar boundary. That river, with its crossings and marshes, shaped a frontier that slowed external advance and gave locals a defensible edge. Fortified headlands and reworked hill forts turned into warning posts, and the countryside organized watchers who knew every creek and ridge. When conflict came, it favored those who could move fast over short distances and vanish into familiar terrain. Tin made the West valuable. Streams and shallow workings supplied a metal that traders wanted across the Atlantic Arch. That demand gave Dumnonia leverage and partners outside Anglo-Saxon circuits. Harbors on the north and south coasts tied the routes that reached Ireland, Armorica, and beyond. Markets handled ingots, livestock, salt, and cloth, keeping wealth in regional hands and funding retinues and church building. Christian communities flourished amid this autonomy. Monastic clusters at places such as Glastonbury and the headland at Tintagel linked prayer, learning, and landholding. Monks copied texts, settled disputes, and hosted travelers. Churchyards drew carved stones with crosses and inscriptions that show literacy in service of faith and law. Ecclesiastical calendars created shared time across scattered settlements, while saints' cults fostered local identity and soft power. Across the Channel, kin and language built bridges to Brittany. Migrants carried names, saints, and customs that echoed back and forth for generations. Rulers exchanged gifts and guests, and families managed claims on both shores, widening the pool of allies in war and marriage. The sea was not a barrier, it was the main road. Pottery from the eastern Mediterranean has been found on Cornish sites, a clear sign that traders in Dumnonia maintained direct or near-direct connections with Byzantine markets long after the Roman system collapsed. In a period when horizons were contracting across much of Europe, this persistence of long-distance exchange is striking. Likewise, the vast slate-built courtyard complex at Tintagel dates to this early era rather than to the later Middle Ages, revealing a high-status residence of a scale seldom seen in post-Roman Britain. Dumnonia, then, can be read as a Western response to the fragmentation around it. Preserve the language, work the tin, guard the overland crossings, and treat the ocean as a highway. From this foundation, the region's later names and stories take shape. Rheged rises in the record as a northern power built around today's Cumbria and the Solway, with reach into southwest Scotland. It formed in the space left when Roman forts fell quiet and landholders turned retinues into governments. Authority gathered in households that could move fast, feed fighters, and hold loyalty through gifts, grazing rights, and sworn bonds. The landscape encouraged that model. Mountains, fells, and lake valleys forced movement into narrow corridors that a small force could block. A warband that knew the passes could keep larger enemies off balance. Military culture sat at the center of rule. Elites trained for mounted raids, shield walls on constricted ground, and ambushes along river crossings. Feasting halls doubled as planning rooms and as places where bards named allies and shamed rivals. Early Welsh verse preserves that habit of praise and memory, and through it we see campaigns and reputations linked to Rheged's kings, with Urien standing out as a ruler who turned geography into tactics. Victories brought breathing room, defeats invited coalitions against them. The terrain shaped more than war. Narrow coastal plains along the Solway, upland pasture, and lowland farms created a mix of subsistence and surplus. Cattle, sheep, and horses formed the movable wealth that funded retainers. Craftsmen attached to courts turned raw metal into spearheads, brooches, and fittings that signaled status. Burial finds in the wider region show high-skill work, and descriptions of elite gear point to workshops capable of fine detail and technical control. Pattern-wielded swords, with their layered steel and flowing surface lines, required precise heat and hammer work, and their presence in verse suggests that such blades were known and prized among Rheged's fighters. Alliances held the borders as much as walls did. To survive between Anglian realms on the east and other Brittonic houses to the west and north, Rheged's rulers married strategically, fostered children across courts, and hosted seasonal councils. Agreements arranged shared campaigns against common threats and set terms for tribute or passage through key routes. Those relationships shifted with fortune. A bad harvest or a lost skirmish could unpick months of diplomacy, sending envoys back on the road to repair terms before rivals exploited the gap. Material traces are thinner than in the south, but they line up with a culture that mixed literacy and local tradition. A 6th century stone from Cumbria, cut with Latin letters spelling Brittonic names, shows clerks and carvers working in two systems at once. Christianity had footholds through small churches and clerical households attached to courts. Clergy kept records, blessed oaths, and curated relics that anchored legitimacy. Sacred sites near routes became neutral ground for arbitration, turning faith into a tool of governance as well as devotion. Rheged reached its apex with sustained campaigns that checked neighbors and drew poets to court. Yet the same networked politics that made rapid gains possible also made the kingdom vulnerable to splits. Sub-kings guarded their autonomy, heirs competed, and coalitions that had supported major offensives frayed when spoils ran thin. East of the Pennines, Northumbria expanded under leaders who could press both military and diplomatic advantages, peeling away allies and securing crossings. By the early 7th century, Rheged's name faded into the orbit of that rising power, its lineages folded into new hierarchies, while its place names and verse kept a quieter record in the hills and along the Solway. Wedged between rising Northumbria and ambitious Mercia, Elmet had a Brittonic enclave where West Yorkshire now sits. Its edges followed ridgelines, rivers, and old trackways rather than straight borders, creating a pocket polity that managed to keep its own councils, church sites, and warbands active for generations. Control rested with local dynasts, who coordinated farms, woods, and fords, and who could summon men from scattered homesteads to guard passes that funneled traffic through the Pennine foothills. This was neither a backwater nor a large state. It was a small kingdom that learned to survive in tight space. Its economy looked mixed by design. Woodland management produced timber, fuel, and grazing, while upland fields supported hardy grain and pasture for cattle and sheep. Valleys hosted orchards and gardens, and streams powered small mills. Settlement patterns included farmsteads with enclosure banks and a smattering of lightly fortified sites on knolls that watched over route junctions. These were not grand hill forts, but practical strongpoints that could hold a levy strong enough to push back a raid or bargain for time. Seasonal movement of herds linked lowland meadows to summer grazing, turning mobility into insurance against bad harvests. For nearly 2 centuries, rulers in Elmet steered a narrow course between more populous neighbors. They paid tribute when necessary and struck when the risk looked favorable, but their main asset was control of terrain that forced invaders to break into columns on narrow roads. Local households equipped with spears, shields, and light gear could move faster than heavier forces drawn from the plains. Diplomacy mattered as much as arms. Marriages, hostages, and shared church patronage kept lines open to the north and south, buying stability in years when grain or manpower ran short. Elmet acted as a cultural buffer as well. Brittonic speech remained the language of home and law, while Christianity anchored literacy and clergy who served at small churches and burial grounds. Cross slabs and memorials show an ongoing habit of inscribing names and blessings, tying families to land and faith. Earlier Celtic traditions persisted in art styles and community assemblies, even as trade and conflict brought contact with Anglian customs from the east. The result was a layered identity that did not dissolve quickly once new rulers arrived. Its fall came fast under King Edwin of Northumbria, whose early 7th century campaign pushed through the corridors Elmet had guarded. Between about 616 and 620, the kingdom lost its leadership and legal autonomy, and its lands folded into Northumbrian governance. Yet memory did not vanish. Later sources still treated Elmet as a named country, not just a district, suggesting that lineage ties and church networks kept the label alive beyond annexation. Place names in the region, along with stories attached to parishes and estates, hint at continuity beneath the new order. Archaeology backs the sense of a local signature. Inscribed stones record Brittonic names in Latin lettering, while pottery from domestic sites shows patterns distinct from both the Western Brittonic zones and the Anglian East. Environmental studies add a surprising detail. Pollen data indicate deliberate reforestation in parts of Elmet during the early 6th century, implying planned landscape management by a polity often treated as marginal. One more echo reaches into modernity. The title Earl of Elmet appeared centuries later, a reminder that this short-lived kingdom left marks on maps, in churches, and in the language of rank that outlasted its walls. Dyfed crowns the ridge above the Firth of Forth, and from that rock, the Gododdin watched three worlds meet. To the north lay Pictish lands, to the southeast, Anglia and Bernicia pushed along the coast. To the west and south, other Brittonic houses held valleys and old roads. That crossroads turned the kingdom into both a gatekeeper and a target. Control of the Lothians meant influence over sea approaches and land corridors, so the rulers at Dyfed kept warriors close and messengers moving along the spine of hills between fortlets and farms. Gododdin power rested on elite warbands bound by oaths, gifts, and honor. Service meant training for seasonal campaigns, escorting envoys, and guarding harvests when raids threatened. Courts operated as moving households, carrying law, storage, and ritual from stronghold to stronghold. Feasts mattered because they paid soldiers in meat, mead, and public recognition. Archaeologists working around Edinburgh have found fortified hilltops with traces of large halls, the kind of buildings that could host councils and reward ceremonies while doubling as command posts over key routes. The kingdom's neighbors shaped its calendar of risk. Bernicia advanced from the Tweed, building posts along the coast and pressing inland toward the Forth. That pressure forced the Gododdin to defend river crossings, coastal plains, and the low passes that bend around the Pentland and Lammermuir hills. Skirmishes decided access to pasture and toll points, and small defeats could cascade if a levy failed to assemble in time. Alliances with nearby Brittonic states helped for a season or two, but the frontier against the Angles never stayed quiet for long. Gododdin society did not abandon its roots while it fought. Brittonic speech framed law and kinship, and church sites tied families to burial grounds and local saints. Carved stones and names in Latin letters point to clerks who could read and write while maintaining native forms. Farmsteads managed mixed agriculture, grain in the better soils of the lowlands, grazing on the uplands, and small craft production that supplied spearheads, brooches, and fittings. Trade followed the coasts and river mouths, bringing goods from the north and east even as Germanic influence increased in nearby settlements. The defining story in later memory is Catraeth. A Brittonic coalition gathered for an offensive that aimed to check Bernician expansion. The campaign ended in heavy losses, and for the Gododdin, it drained the pool of experienced fighters and leaders who held the network together. The aftermath weakened deterrence. Replacements needed seasons to train, and rival courts moved to secure their own positions rather than risk another combined venture. Setback turned into vulnerability. Over the next decades, Northumbria formed from Bernicia to Dara and pressed the advantage. Each defeat cost the Gododdin a ridge, a ford, or an ally. Strongholds still stood, but the capacity to field cohesive forces narrowed. The kingdom's institutions persisted for a time, feasts, warbands, councils, but the map shifted under them, and the line at Dyfed could not hold against a larger state that paired military reach with consolidation. Alt Clwyd rises where the River Clyde narrows, and from that volcanic plug, Strathclyde managed a network of valleys, coasts, and river crossings. The fortress dominated movement between the Irish Sea and the central lowlands, giving its rulers leverage over tolls, hostages, and safe conduct. A royal household at Dumbarton coordinated outlying settlements and strongpoints that watched ferries, fords, and route junctions. Grain, cattle, and tribute in kind sustained a mobile court that could shift to satellite sites when campaigning or when rival claimants pressed the borders. This kingdom held its Brittonic identity long after neighbors changed language and law. Speech, personal names, and church dedications linked the Clyde to Cumbria, while carved stones and cross slabs marked kin lines and legal memory across burial grounds. The political map stretched well south of the Clyde. Estates and hill sites in modern Cumbria supplied men and stores, and local lords there answered to Alt Clwyd in seasons of war. That reach turned Strathclyde into a middleweight power with room to negotiate, raid, and exact tribute. Relations with neighbors ran in cycles. Northumbria could threaten from the east or trade timber and metalwork when peace served both courts. Pictish rulers to the north tested river lines or offered marriage ties. As the Kingdom of Alba formed, pressure shifted into treaties that balanced pasture rights, shared campaigns, and claims over disputed districts. Strathclyde's rulers used hostages, fosterage, and church patronage to manage these links. Bishops and abbots moved messages, authenticated oaths, and stabilized frontier settlements where mixed populations lived under overlapping rules. The internal structure is dim, but patterns stand out. A high king at Alt Clwyd relied on ranked local lords who controlled clusters of farms and small forts. Each lord owed fighters, food, and roadwork, and in return received rights over markets and fines. When danger rose, royal messengers triggered musters along the Clyde and down into the Solway Basin. River transport mattered. Boats ran grain and troops faster than carts, and the court invested labor in docks and storehouses that tied hill country to sea lanes. Norse seafarers altered the balance in the 9th century. Raids probed estuaries, then turned to organize campaigns. In 870, a Viking siege overran Dumbarton Rock after a long blockade, cutting off the garrison from relief. The fall scattered treasure and captives and forced a reorganization of rule. The royal center shifted upward toward Govan and Partick, where burial grounds and carved stones show continued elite presence. Despite the shock, the kingdom reassembled its networks and remained a named power in regional politics. Strathclyde persisted into the late 11th century as an identifiable Brittonic polity. Its rulers fielded armies when northern coalitions formed and took part in the changing politics of Alba. Over time, ties of landholding, intermarriage, and shared campaigns drew Strathclyde into the expanding Scottish kingdom. Absorption did not erase the older line overnight. Legal habits and ecclesiastical links bridged the transition, while estates kept their local names and dues. Dumbarton's defenders relied on a freshwater well cut inside the rock, allowing long resistance under siege without leaving cover. Aberfrost sits on Angsley like a hinge, and from that base, Gwynedd pushed authority across northwest Wales. Mountains formed the back wall. The Menai Strait the front door, giving rulers control over passes and sea lanes. That geography shaped a kingdom that could move troops along ridgelines while merchants and clergy moved by boat between island, mainland, and Irish sea ports. Farms in low valleys fed courts, while upland pastures raised hardy herds that supported retinues year-round. Dynasty mattered as much as stone. Early traditions place Cunetha and his descendants at the root of Gwyned's ruling house, a lineage that kept power by managing succession, marriage alliances, and fosterage. Over generations, the court at Aberfro turned kin networks into an argument for continuity. Lords from Arvan, Thlin, and Meirioneth entered service for privileges, legal standing, and the expectation that their sons would be reared alongside princes, tying families to the center through obligation and advantage. Strongholds anchored this web. Hill forts and rocktop enclosures watched the narrow mouths of roads through Snowdonia, where small garrisons could stall larger armies. Timber and stone halls hosted seasonal assemblies in which rulers judged disputes, levied food rents, and assigned watches along the coast. Maritime access balanced the mountain strategy. Shallow draft boats worked the straits and bays, linking Gwynedd to trade that ran along the Clyde to the Severn and across to Ireland and Brittany, bringing salt, wine containers, metalwork, and cloth into local markets. Gwyned's rulers shaped a broader Welsh identity by sponsoring law, language, and the church. Legal custom developed into detailed codes that addressed status, fines, property, and guardianship, articulating rights across ranks from king to commoner. Poets and jurists found patronage at court, fixing memory in verse and precedent. Churches at Bangor and on Anglia held land and influence, hosted synods, and supplied clerks who maintained records and witnessed oaths. As neighboring polities shifted, this legal and cultural core gave Gwynedd a framework that could absorb allies and vassals without erasing their local habits. Conflict pressed from the east. Mercian campaigns targeted the border cantrefs, seeking control of river corridors and low passes. Gwynedd answered with raids into the March and with alliances among Welsh neighbors to split enemy attention. Later, English kings brought heavier pressure, building castles in the borderlands and garrisoning river crossings. Even so, the terrain favored defenders who knew every saddle and bog, and Gwynedd used that advantage repeatedly to offset superior numbers and resources. In the 12th and 13th centuries, rulers consolidated that edge with administration and reform. Llewellyn ap Iorwerth strengthened central oversight, coordinated hostages and tribute, and cultivated church support to validate claims. His successors refined levies, standardized dues, and improved coastal musters. Under Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, the principality expanded reach through treaties, marriage, and fortress building, with commanders assigned to hold key valleys and estuaries. Councils at Aberfrow and other seats handled land disputes, inheritance, and the integration of marcher lords who accepted terms. The preserved law books show intricate rules for inheritance, marriage arrangements, and compensation payments, revealing a legal tradition of unusual precision for medieval Europe. Powys grows in the middle ground, where valleys open east toward the plains and ridges fold back into the Welsh interior. From scattered late Roman communities, farm clusters, roadside shrines, and hilltop refuges, a political core formed that could answer raids and levy dues. Over time, local leaders aligned courts and musters, and the name Powys covered a territory that held the Severn and Dee headwaters, along with the tracts that linked upland pasture to lowland fields. The position mattered. Whoever held those corridors controlled movement between Britain's high country and its eastern zones. Agriculture gave the kingdom its staying power. The broad floors of the Severn and Vyrnwy valleys supported grain and hay, while slopes carried cattle and sheep that could move when trouble neared. Storehouses near river fords kept surplus ready for muster seasons. With food secure, rulers invested in fortified royal sites, enclosures on knolls and river terraces that combined halls, chapels, and small garrisons. These hubs coordinated roadwork, bridge repair, and watch duties, and they hosted courts where disputes settled under customary law and oath. Mercia loomed across the border. From the 7th century onward, Powysian rulers fought a rolling contest for fords, fields, and the honor of not paying tribute. Campaigning followed the rivers. Powys struck at supply lines along the Trent approaches and burned outposts when Mercian levies spread thin. In turn, Mercian drives aimed to pry open the Severn corridor and fix garrisons near fertile ground. The frontier hardened along an earthwork that stretched over 150 miles. Built by Mercia, Offa's Dyke nonetheless became a working line for Powys, part obstacle, part reference point for tolls, grazing rights, and safe conduct. Unity was never guaranteed. At times, eastern and western branches acted as semi-independent sub-kingdoms, each with its own court and agenda. Shared ancestry tied them together, but practical rule demanded room from local elites. In good years, a senior ruler coaxed joint campaigns and common dues. In lean sessions, rivalries splintered effort and forced quick settlements to keep harvests safe. Even with divisions, the habit of assembly and arbitration endured, keeping border feuds from turning into civil collapse. Culture traveled with the court. Poets held office, not just favor, shaping memory through praise and counsel. Their work recorded lineages, victories, and the obligations of hospitality. This literary traffic fed into early Welsh law and court culture, giving Powys a voice that carried beyond its borders. Church sites along river bends anchored learning and landholding. Clerics witnessed land grants, kept obits, and taught heirs to read names and reckon dues, meshing spiritual authority with practical administration. By the 12th century, external pressures sharpened. Norman lords advanced from the east, building mottes along roads and near mills, and demanding hostages or rent from communities that once answered Powys alone. At the same time, stronger Welsh principalities to the north and west drew lesser rulers into their orbits through marriage and treaty. Powys adapted, shifting courts, striking alliances, and conceding districts to hold core valleys. But autonomy narrowed as castle chains and new tax systems took root. Offa's Dyke ranks among medieval Europe's longest earthworks, and on the ground, it served Powys as a practical boundary and a bargaining line. Several former tribal districts, Pembrokeshire, Carmarthenshire, and nearby cantrefs, aligned under rulers who could move men along coastal tracts as easily as along ridgeways. The kingdom formed as local elites stitched estates into a coherent authority that collected dues, enforced oaths, and kept harbors working. Its map is a coastline first. Bays, estuaries, and islands where boats could beach, load tin and hides, and sail before a land army could react. Maritime links shaped policy and profit. Ports on St. Bride's Bay and the Milford Haven waters brought traffic from Ireland and the North Channel, and smaller inlets on Cardigan Bay handled short-hop trade. Fishermen, pilots, and shipwrights became strategic actors because rulers needed hulls as much as horses. Inland, river valleys provided grain and pasture, but the court invested in landing places, beacon points, and storehouses near the shore. When storms or raiders threatened, coastal settlements emptied into nearby strongholds, then returned to repair and reload as soon as masts reappeared on the horizon. Ties with Ireland ran deep. Names cut into Ogham stones mark settlers and kin groups with roots across the sea, and those markers stand near routes that connect fields to coves. Bilingual inscriptions preserve Latin forms alongside early Irish, a sign that clerks and stonemasons navigated two literacies at once. Through these links, Dyfed exchanged more than people. Monks, craftsmen, and traders crossed with goods and habits, from ecclesiastical calendars to metalworking techniques that traveled with families and saints' cults. Government worked through a lattice of small royal estates, coastal settlements, and inland forts. A king's household moved between sites to collect renders, grain, ale, hides, and ship timber, and to settle disputes. Local lords managed day-to-day defense, keeping watch on river mouths and ferry points, while inland strongholds guarded cattle routes and market paths. This distributed model kept the realm responsive. A beacon lit at a bay or headland could pull a levy to the water's edge before a raiding crew found a soft target. The 9th century brought new pressure. Viking ships felt out the coves and river mouths, first for quick strikes, then for wintering and trade under guard. Raids scattered herds and disrupted toll points, and occasional settlement created mixed communities that needed new rules. Dyfed's leaders alternated payments, counter-raids, and alliances with neighbors to manage the strain. Some seasons, fleets gathered for punitive runs across the Irish Sea. Others, the court recalibrated dues to replace stock and rebuild granaries. Religious centers gave the kingdom standing beyond its borders. St. David's, near the western edge, drew pilgrims along roads that threaded the peninsula, and its clergy maintained contacts that reached courts in Ireland and beyond. Bishops witnessed land grants, arbitrated quarrels between local lords, and anchored literacy that served both church and state. Donations in land and immunities tied estates to altars, and festivals filled markets that carried goods along the coast. Over time, influence shifted south and east as Deheubarth rose. Dynastic unions drew Dyfed's estates into that larger framework, and the sea lanes that once defined a separate kingdom continued to feed a broader principality. Kent faces the Channel, and that short stretch of water shaped an early kingdom. Migrants from the continent settled the southeast in the 5th and 6th centuries, clustering around good soils and existing Roman routes. Royal households grew from these settlements into a framework of estates that could gather renders and field warbands. The coastal tilt mattered. Ports and ferries linked Kent not only to other English shores, but to the Frankish realms, where trade, marriage, and diplomacy moved faster than along Britain's inland tracks. Those cross-channel ties left marks on rule and fashion. Embassies could cross in days, and goods followed: textiles, glass, wine containers, and craft techniques. Kentish rulers leveraged these connections to raise prestige and secure allies, while Frankish courts treated Kent as a familiar neighbor rather than a distant island province. The flow worked both ways. Ideas about governance, coin use, and court ceremony traveled with gifts and brides, giving Kent a continental accent that set it apart from inland kingdoms. Power organized around royal estates and two early urban anchors, Canterbury and Rochester. Estate centers coordinated agriculture, storage, and hospitality, while the towns acted as hubs for tolls, markets, and legal business. Craftspeople worked near gates and wharfs, fixing tools, casting ornaments, and outfitting retinues. Roads knitted the network to outlying farms and river mouths, so the king's officials could collect food rents and summon labor for bridges, causeways, and watch duty. This administrative mesh let rulers tax movement as well as harvests. Religious change added a new layer. In 597, Augustine arrived and established a seat that grew into the archbishopric at Canterbury. Churches and monasteries followed, supported by land grants that bound the clergy to royal interests. Bishops and abbots kept records, authenticated oaths, and served as envoys when talks with neighbors stalled. Through these institutions, Christianity spread along Kent's estate lines and market roads, tying belief to the everyday work of governance and trade. Kent's law shows how distinct its system became. Under King Ethelbert, scribes wrote the earliest surviving English law codes, listing fines, compensations, and ranks that calibrated status and injury. The text reads like a toolkit for keeping peace in a busy, mixed economy, clear values for harm at markets, on roads, and within households. Measuring penalties in Kentish shillings reinforced a local unit of account and gave courts a practical way to settle disputes without endless feuding. Kent rarely ruled without rivals pressing in. Mercia's rise brought campaigns and overlordship that clipped away royal autonomy, sometimes replacing kings with client rulers, other times extracting tribute and hostages. Later, Wessex exerted its own pull, seeking access to the southeast's ports and revenues. Internal factions took sides as fortunes shifted, so succession could turn on outside backing as much as lineage. By the 8th century, Kent looked like a prize rather than a hegemon, contested, reorganized, and periodically partitioned to suit stronger neighbors. Even within that competition, the kingdom produced goods that signaled skill and status. Kentish jewelry, especially cloisonné garnet work from high-status graves, shows technical control that stands with the best continental workshops. The workmanship speaks to specialist knowledge, a supply of garnets, careful goldworking, and workshop organization based near elite households and ports. The legal habit outlasted power. Courts still counted in Kentish shillings, and clerks trained at Canterbury kept copying charters. That continuity made Kent legible to neighbors, even when its crown sat in someone else's hands. The coastline pulled settlers in, and the forest held them apart. Sussex formed along the Channel and in the late 5th century as South Saxon groups took root on good soils near river mouths while keeping one eye on the sea lanes. Settlement clustered where estuaries met downland, but early growth stayed uneven because the inland barrier was real. The Weald, dense woodland with heavy clay, slowed plows, broke roads, and turned travel into a seasonal job. Communities stayed dispersed, with hamlets strung along clearings and ridges rather than massed around a single capital. That landscape produced a political style. Local leaders controlled pockets of cleared land, hunting rights, and trackways that threaded the woods. The kingdom looked like a patchwork of districts, each with its own hall, muster point, and obligations. Royal authority existed, but it traveled on footpaths and ridge routes, not in straight lines on a map. Renders came in timber, pigs from pannage, and small grain surpluses from lighter soils along the chalk. When danger rose, levies assembled where tracks converged at fords and gaps through the South Downs. Relative independence lasted, yet Sussex never became a top-tier hegemon. It remained smaller and less centralized than neighbors on the Thames or in the West. Periods of local strength hinged on a leader who could harmonize sub-kings and enforce dues across the Wealden districts. In weaker years, rival halls settled their own accounts and cut deals beyond the kingdom's borders. The rhythm tilted local. Keep the woods guarded, keep the shore watched, and bargain for breathing room with whoever held the next valley. Christianity came late by Southern standards. Missionaries reached the South Saxons in the later 7th century with backing from Wessex. Conversion followed the roads of administration: a church planted near a royal site, a baptism at a seasonal assembly, A priest lodged in a retainer's hall. Over time, ministers gained land and exemptions, and clerics recorded gifts that tied scattered estates into a recognizable network. Burial grounds with crosses and simple stone markers marked the slow shift from older rites to church-centered community life. Multiple rulers appear in the early pattern, which points to a decentralized structure. Sub-kings or regional leaders govern their own districts, each answerable in theory to an over-king. That setup fit the terrain, but limited rapid mobilization. Coordination depended on trusted messengers and predictable meeting points. As larger powers expanded, that system turned from advantage to liability. A strong neighbor could pull one district into alliance and leave another isolated. By the 8th century, pressure from Mercia grew. Sussex slid into a zone of influence where tribute, hostages, and garrisons became part of the political calendar. Later, West Saxon power reached eastward, seeking access to ports in the coastal strip. Integration followed, first through overlordship and shared campaigns, then through administrative absorption that shifted judicial and fiscal habits toward a larger southern polity. Archaeology fills gaps in the written word. Coastal trading sites now show cross-channel exchange stronger than surviving texts suggest, with imported goods moving into local markets near harbors and river mouths. Aerial surveys have traced the Chichester dikes, long, linear earthworks that once formed part of a defensive landscape and point to organized labor and planning capacity. On the map, Sussex preserves a dense cluster of place names ending in ing, a sign of clan-based settlements and the fragmented social structure that shaped early rule. From shore to forest edge, that pattern explains how Sussex formed, held on, and eventually yielded to its larger neighbors. Essex took shape along the Thames estuary, where river and sea met and traffic never stopped. Early East Saxon rulers drew authority from settlements that mattered for movement and money: London to the west, Malden on the Blackwater, and Colchester on the old Roman road grid. Controls of quays, ferries, and causeways allowed kings to tax goods and protect access to salt, fish, and pasture. Estates near tidal waters supplied grain and livestock to royal households, while inland routes linked farm clusters to market points at river crossings. Colchester's Roman walls still offered a defensible focus, and Malden's causeway made it a lever on coastal shipping. Trade defined Essex's early significance. Barges worked the Thames channels, moving timber, hides, and metalwork between creeks and wharfs, while seagoing craft stepped out to ports on the Kentish and continental shores. Tolls at fords and landings added steady revenue. River islands and marsh edges created natural checkpoints, so officials could control traffic without garrisons at every bend. This geography rewarded local elites who kept boats, maintained embankments, and raised watchmen at beacon points. When fleets gathered, they did so at predictable tide windows, and royal agents timed levies and portage to match those cycles. Religion arrived, receded, and returned before it settled. Early in the 7th century, missionaries found converts among East Saxon rulers, and churches rose near royal sites and old Roman precincts. Within a generation, setbacks and shifting alliances produced a reversion to older rites in parts of this realm. Clergy withdrew from some estates, and burial customs varied from district to district. Later efforts, backed by neighboring powers and new episcopal support, re-established Christian practice more firmly. The result was a patchwork that only gradually smoothed into a consistent network of ministers, chapels, and parish responsibilities tied to estate boundaries and market roads. political structure followed the landscape. The East Saxon king relied on sub-kings and prominent households that commanded their own districts. They acknowledged royal primacy, paid dues, and answered calls for military service, but they guarded local courts and rights. This autonomy kept administration flexible, yet it also left room for outside influence. Kent pressed claims through marriage, trade, and occasional overlordship, using its channel access to sway Essex factions. Later, Mercia exerted heavier control, drawing tribute and shaping succession when conflicts opened with the East Saxon line. London sat within Essex's orbit, but rarely under simple royal hand. The city's commercial pull and ecclesiastical stature gave it separate standing. Bishops managed church property and negotiated with rulers beyond Essex, and merchants oriented their dealings to river networks that reached past any single kingdom. Charters and toll arrangements recognized this special status, which meant that control of London involved cooperation as much as command. Its markets absorbed goods from Essex estates but also tied the region to broader price movements and foreign demand. As the 8th and 9th centuries wore on, Essex's autonomy narrowed. Mercian power set the terms for much of the southeast, and later West Saxon expansion folded East Saxon lands into a larger framework of courts, coinage, and defense obligations. Local elites retained influence by managing estates and serving as royal officials, yet decisions that once rested in Essex moved outward to regional centers. East Anglia grows on flat country with long horizons. Norfolk and Suffolk give it fertile soils, big river mouths, and open routes to the North Sea. Those features led an early dynasty, the Wuffingas, turn scattered settlements into a coherent kingdom by the 6th century. Royal sites developed near navigable waters and old Roman trackways, so officials could move grain, livestock, and people efficiently. Estates supplied food rents and labor to a court that shifted across seasonal residences, rewarding service with land use rights and protection on roads and at ferries. By the later 6th century and early 7th centuries, East Anglia stood among the main English powers. Its rulers negotiated marriages, exchanged gifts with neighboring courts, and fielded warbands along the fen edges and coastal plains. Influence depended on speed across level ground and on control of river crossings, so bridges, fords, and causeways mattered more than hill forts. When alliances tilted, these routes became pressure points. A king who could hold toll sites and keep barges moving gained leverage without fighting a set-piece battle. Christianization advanced quickly under Sigebert. He supported churches and monastic houses that tied administration to new literate networks. Clergy copied texts, taught reading, and kept records of land grants that stabilized property and dues. Ecclesiastical centers drew artisans and traders to fairs linked to saints' days, feeding an economy that already looked outward across the North Sea. With clerics attached to courts, disputes could rely on written settlements in addition to oath and ordeal, giving the kingdom tools to manage succession and estate boundaries. Material culture showcases wealth and contact. High-status cemeteries reveal furnished burials with imported goods, fine metalwork, and crafted weaponry. Workshops turned out brooches, belt fittings, and glass that matched continental fashions. River ports sent out hides, wool, and surplus grain, and received wine containers, beads, and metal blanks. Ship repair yards and landing places lined estuaries, connecting inland farm clusters to coastal markets. These channels carried news as well as goods, keeping East Anglia plugged into changing power balances from Frisia to Frankish Gaul. The Woofinga's name anchors the political story, but the economy explains longevity. Flat, arable fields produced steady yields, and salt making along mudflats added a reliable surplus. Administrators linked royal estates with outlying holdings through reeves who enforced dues and musters. When trouble rose, messages moved downriver faster than a mounted envoy could cross upland. That coordination allowed quick levies along predictable approaches and protected harvests that paid for retinues and church patronage. The 9th century brought sustained Viking pressure. Raids began as seasonal strikes on monasteries and markets, then widened to overwintering and political demands. Fortified river sites and mobile levies blunted some attacks, but repeated campaigns drained stores and disrupted the court's circuit. Defeats forced terms that folded East Anglia into the Danelaw. Law tribute and coin use shifted towards Scandinavian practice in market towns, while rural communities adjusted rents and labor to new lords who kept existing fields and dues largely intact. Even under the new regimes, the region kept a distinct identity. Local saints' cults, estate patterns, and speech habits persisted. Craftspeople continued familiar styles along Norse elements, and agricultural routines matched the same soils and seasons. Memory of older rule lived in place names and in the church's property lists. We left Britain splitting into many centers of power, and one of them fused two rivals into a single heavyweight. Northumbria began as Bernicia in the north and Dara in the south, a coast-to-coast belt of land running from the Humber to the Firth of Forth. When their dynasties aligned, the result was a kingdom large enough to set the rhythm for the north. Its long shoreline, river routes like the Tyne and Wear, and access to the Pennine Passes gave it reach that few neighbors could match. Through the 7th and 8th centuries, Northumbrian kings threw their weight around. Armies moved quickly along these routes, striking at Brittonic holdouts to the west and Anglian rivals to the south. Tribute came in goods and allegiance. Royal courts rewarded loyal thanes and kept restless nobles near the center. Yet authority stretched unevenly. In the far uplands and former Brittonic districts, royal commands needed local intermediaries, eldermen, bishops, and strongmen with their own followings to make policy stick. Power did not come from the sword alone. Monasteries at Lindisfarne, Wearmouth Jarrow, and Whitby drew talent, wealth, and attention. Scribes learned to copy and illuminate. Craftsmen mixed pigments, and teachers trained a clerical class that could manage estates and advise rulers. These houses imported books and ideas and exported learning. The output traveled with envoys and pilgrims, so Northumbria's reputation reached far beyond its borders and fed back into royal prestige at home. Rival lineages still pulled at the framework. Bernician and Darran factions backed different heirs and weighed old loyalties against new bargains. A king who owed his crown to one faction risked alienating the other, so coups, exiles, and sudden reversals punctuated the narrative. Some reigns stabilized the union, others fractured it for years. Boundaries held on maps, but on the ground, a lord's oath or a bishop's support could tilt entire districts. Religion also set the course of the kingdom. In 664, the decision at Whitby resolved competing practices in favor of Roman alignment. That choice standardized calculation of Easter and monastic customs and tied Northumbria more tightly to networks in the south and across the Channel. The move brought uniformity to liturgy and church governance, which, in turn, helped administration. A shared calendar and rulebook made it easier to coordinate taxes in kind, host assemblies, and mobilize men. The late 8th century introduced a new pressure. Raiding parties struck coastal targets, and in 793, the attack on Lindisfarne signaled that even sacred centers were exposed. Monasteries had wealth concentrated in portable form, books, metals, and livestock, so they became targets as well as patrons of learning. Raids disrupted estate cycles, destabilized coastal lordships, and forced rulers to spend resources on defense and diplomacy rather than expansion. As the 9th century wore on, southern Northumbria fell under Scandinavian control and entered the Danelaw. Law codes, markets, and leadership shifted with it. North of the Tees and into the old Bernician heartlands, power splintered into smaller polities that bargained with Norse leaders, Scots, and English kings. Authority became local again, and survival depended on flexible alliances. Northumbria's scribes still aimed for excellence. The Lindisfarne Gospels used pigments sourced from as far as Afghanistan, proof that fragile trade threads tied the North Sea to distant mines and workshops. A writer at Wearmouth Jarrow compiled a history that set a template for how early medieval people wrote about time, kings, and the church. Even in decline, the North preserved echoes of empire, hill forts reused as courts, sea lanes guarded by mixed crews, and monasteries rebuilding after fire with the same stubborn confidence that had first lit their scriptoria. Northumbria's story set the stage in the north. Now, the Midlands step forward. Mercia grew along rivers that cut central England from east to west, the Trent, Severn, and their web of tributaries. Those arteries carried food rents, iron from woodland smelters, salt from brine pits, and news that moved as fast as a horse could ford. Settlements clustered at crossings and fords, where tolls and hospitality bound local elites to a royal court that shifted between palace sites. From these nodes, Mercia learned to project force without sitting still. Rulers in Mercia leaned on both spear and handshake. They fought to break rival coalitions and then sealed settlements with marriages, fosterage, and oaths. Smaller kingdoms on their borders, Hwicce in the west, Lindsey between the rivers in the northeast, and others in the southeast, found Mercian overlordship hard to resist when tribute, protection, and a place at assemblies came as a package. Military levies could move along river valleys in days, while messengers carried instructions to reeves who managed food supplies and bridge works that kept those levies rolling. The landscape helped. Wetlands held fish weirs and drove millstones. Uplands supplied charcoal for smiths who forged spearheads and fittings. Market days grew near minsters and royal villas, where priests recorded gifts and disputes, and where reeves counted hides and tallied renders in ale, honey, and livestock. A king could tighten his grip by founding a minster, granting lands to it, and stationing loyal clerics who could read, account, and preach obedience alongside salvation. Mercia reached its high-water mark under Offa. He drew tribute from the southeast, spoke to peers across the Channel, and marked borders with a statement of labor and intent, the long earthwork that ran beside the Welsh frontier. He minted widely, regulated weights, and pulled coin use into a regular system that favored stable trade. Courts under his authority arbitrated rivalries among earls and churchmen, keeping magnates invested in a peace that ran through his hands. When he curbed unruly neighbors, he did it with campaigns that closed quickly because routes and supplies had been prepared months in advance. Monasteries and administrative hubs gave the kingdom coherence. Minsters anchored estates that flowed revenues toward the royal household while training a cadre of clerks who could draft charters and advise on property law. Abbots and abbesses served as political actors, relaying policy, staffing negotiations, and hosting councils that smoothed succession or settled blood feuds. Their scriptoria copied service books and produced documents that turned oral agreements into enforceable promises. After Offa's death, the web loosened. Successors faced fractional pressure from entrenched families who had grown rich on royal favor. Wessex pressed from the south and southwest, using marriage ties and force to detach client rulers. Some Mercian kings recovered leverage for a time, but each recovery cost concessions, and each concession empowered a rival lord who expected more at the next gathering. At the same time, large Scandinavian armies arrived and broke the habit of predictable campaigning. Garrisons had to be paid, harvests had to be protected, forts needed repairs. Territories fell away, and the political map fractured into zones that owed as much to local war leaders as to any royal center. Offa even struck a gold piece modeled on an Islamic dinar, complete with Arabic script, a startling signal that Mercia watched and copied what worked in wider markets. And if you trace county lines on a modern map, Staffordshire, Derbyshire, you still walk the old Mercian grid, where boundaries etched for renders and musters shaped everyday life far beyond the kingdom's last coronation. Mercia's shadow hangs over the Western Midlands, but before it settled in, the Hwicce held their own ground. Their lands ran along the lower Severn and into the Cotswolds, a patchwork that later hardened into Worcestershire, Gloucestershire, and parts of Warwickshire. In the wake of Rome's retreat, local authorities gave way to new leaders who organized defenses, managed estates, and drew in settlers from the east. From these layers, a dynasty surfaced that issued gifts to churches and negotiated peace with neighbors while shaping a kingdom that moved with the flow of its rivers. The cultural mix stood out. Settlement clusters with timber halls and Grubenhauser sat beside older sites that kept Brittonic place names alive. Roads followed Roman lines where they still made sense, but villages shifted to high ground above floodplains. Early ecclesiastical spots linked to pre-existing sacred places, tying newer communities to local memory. You can read the blend in the landscape: hill names that sound Brittonic, field systems that look Anglo-Saxon, and estate centers that bridged both worlds through marriage and patronage. That overlap gave Hwicce elites a larger toolbox: laws spoken in the hall, charters drafted by clerics, and customary rites remembered by older families. Power had limits. Hwicce rulers exchanged tribute and oaths with larger neighbors, and Mercia, rising to the northeast and west, became the partner that set the terms most often. Overlordship meant attending assemblies, supplying men for campaigns, and accepting arbitration when disputes ran hot. In return, the Hwicce kept local control and drew protection for markets and minsters. As Mercian kings tightened their hold on the Midlands, the Hwicce framework bent rather than broke, integrating lords into Mercian networks without erasing their local authority overnight. Religious centers did the heavy lifting of order. Gloucester and Worcester minsters organized tithes, taught the calendar, and hosted courts where boundaries were walked and sworn. Their clergy kept lists of renders, honey, grain, and livestock, and recorded settlements that turned quarrels into obligations. Monasteries managed outlying estates with reeves who watched mills, ferry points, and fish weirs. With every land grant and baptismal circuit, churchmen mapped the kingdom in ink and ritual, pulling scattered communities into a shared rhythm of fasts, feasts, and law days. Farming carried the economy. The Severn and Avon valleys supported open field plots of barley and wheat, with meadowlands for hay and upland pastures for seasonal grazing. Villages built granaries and small mills where streams allowed. Traders moved salt, iron fittings, and surplus grain along predictable routes. Local fairs drew craftsmen, smiths, weavers, and woodworkers, whose output equipped households and retinues. Archaeology in farmsteads shows storage pits, loom weights, and bone combs alongside iron knives and buckles, the ordinary kit of communities with enough surplus to trade and to invest in better tools. By the late 8th century, independence had thinned. Mercian administration reached deeper, placing trusted men in border districts and coordinating taxation across shires that echoed older Hwicce territories. Yet the name held on in church structures, and diocesan lines tracked the old shape of the kingdom long after royal titles faded. Excavations at Bishop's Cleeve uncovered an early timber hall that signals high-status assembly or ceremonial use before written notice of Hwicce appears, a reminder that authority often leaves posts in the ground before it leaves words on parchment. Mercia's advance along the Midlands leaves a gap to the northeast. Lindsey fills it. The kingdom took shape in the lowlands between the Humber and the Witham, where dry ridges rose above marsh and river. Those corridors made movement predictable and profitable. Boats hauled grain and salt. Drovers followed causeways to seasonal markets. Toll points sat at ferry crossings that tied inland estates to the estuary. The soil paid out well in barley and wheat, and meadows along the Ancholm and Witham supported cattle through winters that would bury lighter pastures elsewhere. Rulers in Lindsey managed opportunity and risk at the same time. Independence held through the 6th and early 7th centuries, but neighbors kept their eyes on the prize. Northumbria wanted access to the Humber's mouth and the routes it fed. Mercia wanted the rivers that bridged its heartland to the east coast. Lindsey's elites understood the game and built a system that did not depend on a single palace. Several royal sites, estate centers with halls, storehouses, and nearby burial grounds, spread authority across districts. That spread reduced the danger of a single coup and made collection of renders steadier because local officials could gather dues where people lived rather than dragging them to a far capital. Christian practice reached Lindsey by mid-century through missionaries who traveled the river lines and set up early minsters close to older settlements. Churches grew near market nodes, where priests could reach the most people on feast days and trading days. Baptismal circuits followed the same tracks as toll collectors and reeves, and new cemeteries signaled the adoption of Christian rites alongside older customs. With clergy came literacy, and with literacy came charters that fixed gifts and boundaries more firmly than memory alone. Pressure mounted as Northumbrian and Mercian kings tried to pull Lindsey into their orbit. Seizing the region meant controlling river mouths, calling levies faster, and taxing traffic that could not avoid the waterways. Armies moved along the dry ridges and forded at known points. Once a ruler held these crossings, he could compel tribute from the estates beyond. Control changed hands more than once. Each takeover reset alliances and left fresh grants on parchment that blessed the new arrangement while quietly erasing the old. Archaeology fills in the details the annals skip. Richly furnished graves show ranks within society. Warriors buried with spears, shields, and ornate belts. Women with beads, brooches, and tools for weaving. Imported items appear in some burials and settlements, glass vessels, fine metalwork, and goods that tell a story of links to the North Sea world. Markets at river landings drew traders from across the water, and local smiths learned styles and techniques that traveled with them. A burial at Barnock yielded a glass drinking horn from the continent, a reminder that Lindsey's feasts echoed elite rituals shared from Frisia to the Rhineland. The land itself explains the kingdom's name. Lindsey comes from Lindisi, the island of Linden, a nod to the raised ground that once sat ringed by wetlands before later drainage reshaped the plain. That island quality helped define borders, slowed invaders, and channeled trade into predictable streams. When larger powers finally absorbed Lindsey, they kept using the same routes, the same crossings, and many of the same estate centers. The badge changed. The machinery kept working. Northumbria's reach stalled at a northern wall of hill forts and carved stones. Beyond that line stretched Pictland, a patchwork of peoples in northern and eastern Scotland who shared languages, symbols, and customs but answered to several regional rulers. Over time, shifting alliances and repeated campaigns pulled that loose network toward a more centralized frame. The terrain encouraged local power, coasts cut by firths, straths that channeled travel, and uplands that favored strongholds over open towns. So unification looked like cooperation backed by seasonal musters rather than a single all-seeing court. Art speaks first. Across the northeast and the far north, sculptors set up symbol stones, slabs engraved with paired emblems, knotwork, and scenes of riders and hunts. Scholars still debate meaning, lineages, office marks, land claims, or ritual signs. What stands out is the system. The same motifs recur across distances that would take days to cross, which hints at shared rules for who could display what. Some stones stand near assembly sites and old tracks, as if the marks announced presence and authority to anyone moving through the district. Early testimony calls the Picts a confederation, and the archaeology matches that. Regional kingships rose around fertile corridors and old power bases, each able to field retinues and impose dues on farms and coastal landing spots. In some years, neighboring rulers cooperated to face an external threat. In some years, neighboring rulers cooperated to face an external threat. In others, they fought over cattle routes or tribute from islands and river mouths. The Confederate model explains why scribes sometimes recorded several kings active at once, and why titles traveled with marriages and hostages as much as with conquests. A hard edge underpinned the culture. Fortified hilltops crowned with timber defenses and stone ramparts watched over straths and sea lanes. Enclosed settlements dotted lower ground, holding burhs, workshops, and granaries under the eyes of local heads. Smiths forged spearheads, pins, and fittings. Herders moved cattle between summer and winter pasture. Crews launched boats for inshore fishing and short sea journeys. Warrior followings trained for quick raids and stand-up fights, which made them effective in border wars and volatile in peacetime politics. From the 6th century, missionaries from Iona carried Christianity north and east. Monastic sites appeared alongside pre-Christian practices, and the two systems lived side by side for generations. Churches organized fasts and feasts, taught reading to a narrow clerical elite, and served as safe venues for truces and pledges. Monks mapped districts with gospel books and altar dues, while local law still ran on kingship, compensation, and oath-taking. The overlap created durable institutions without erasing older obligations. Conflict with Northumbria defined a turning point. Campaigns pushed into Pictish ground until a decisive clash at Dumnonia in 685 stopped that advance. The result held the frontier and bought time for internal consolidation, as leaders who proved themselves in war gained leverage over rivals. Control of passes and coasts mattered most, because whoever taxed shipping and guarded fords controlled the flow of wealth. By the 9th century, political gravity shifted again, as Pictish and Gaelic elites merged with Dal Riata, forming the base of Alba. Names and titles changed, but forts, churches, and routes kept working. Genetic studies of Pictish burials show high mobility, hinting at migration and marriage links that cross seas and straits. On carved stones, animals with no British habitat, including the Pictish beast, point to lost symbol codes or to artists who borrowed forms seen on rare goods and traveler's gear. The stones still stand where law and memory met, holding a map, heed to those who knew how to read it. Dal Riata grew across water, not roads, linking northeast Ireland and western Scotland into a single Gaelic sphere. Its Scottish core sat in Argyll and the Inner Hebrides, where short sea crossings tied peninsulas, islands, and sea locks into one navigable map. Rulers fortified headlands and isthmuses that overlooked straits, so a small garrison and a lookout could control who moved through a channel and when dues were paid. Those forts anchored a maritime economy. Crews rowed and sailed between kin settlements scattered along inlets that offered beaches for landing and slopes for pasture. Timber halls stood above boat pulls, with storehouses for dried fish, cured meat, and grain from narrow valleys. Ferries carried cattle and textiles to exchanges where metalwork and salt changed hands. Chiefs scheduled gatherings to match wind and tides, knowing retinues could muster faster by sea than by any overland track that crossed bog and mountain. Mobility shaped the kingdom's strength. Fleets of wooden vessels, lashed planks, and light frames moved warriors, goods, and clergy on regular circuits. A summons could bring men from Mull, Islay, and Kintyre to a rendezvous in days. That speed let Dal Riata raid, trade, and respond to threats with the same toolset. It also spread ideas. Gaelic speech and law codes traveled with fostered youth and marriage alliances, seeding customs along the western seaboard and nudging neighboring polities to treat the sea as a roadway rather than a border. At the center of its cultural gravity stood Iona. Founded within Dal Riata's orbit, the monastery ran schools for scribes, kept computus tables for the calendar, and maintained ties that reached across Britain and back to Ireland. Monks trained missionaries who carried books, relics, and a tested routine for creating new churches. That routine, land grant, wooden chapel, graveyard, seasonal preaching, stitched communities to a wider Christian framework while reinforcing elite authority through patronage and record-keeping. Pressure never let up. Pictish rulers contested frontier glens and watched the sea lanes. Norse raiders later struck at exposed coasts, testing every harbor and island store. Inside the dynasty, rival branches argued over succession, pulled support from different districts, and sometimes split the fleet. In strong years, kings coordinated tribute, settled disputes at assemblies, and rotated garrisons. In weaker years, local lords acted first and asked permission later, leaving the royal household to catch up. By the 9th century, the Scottish branch fed directly into the making of Alba. Gaelic and Pictish elites blended titles and practices, while forts, churches, and anchorages kept serving their old roles under new banners. The maritime habits survived the political shift, so the routes that once bound Dal Riata continued to carry messengers, levies, and dues for an emergent kingdom that faced in two directions, toward the North Sea and back along the Atlantic fringe. Recent work points to fleets using lightweight, hide-covered currachs on long runs. Those boats handled swell, beached easily, and could be repaired with local materials, giving commanders range that matched later Viking mobility on many routes. And some kings held authority on both sides of the Channel, issuing orders in Irish districts and Hebridean islands alike. That cross-channel rule turned tide tables into policy, because the window for sailing decided who met, who paid, and who arrived with an armed escort. Across these forgotten kingdoms, the true foundations of Britain emerged, not from empire or conquest alone, but from centuries of cultures rising, falling, and reshaping the island's identity. If you enjoyed uncovering this hidden history, be sure to subscribe for more lost stories the textbooks never taught you.